Good morning. I'm Alice Newland, and I'm the co-president of the League of Women Voters of Manatee County. On behalf of the League, I welcome you to today's presentation on the implications of the 2023 Florida legislative session. The 2023 legislative session was among the most wide-ranging and impactful of all of Florida's legislative sessions. My email was continuously full of action alerts to oppose something and occasionally an action alert to support something. But today we're going to learn how the League determines the legislative priorities. It advocates not only by contacting with action alerts, but also monitoring and lobbying. And we're also going to hear what were the significant legislative changes and their implications. This program is being recorded and will be available on lwvmanatee.org. It is the property of the League, and no part can be copied or reproduced without the written permission of the League. We have two speakers today, and they will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So please put your questions in chat and direct them to our Government Action Chair, Ginger McCallum. Ginger will present the questions at the end of both of the presentations. Our first speaker today is Trish Neely, President of the League of Women Voters of Tallahassee. Trish previously was a member of the League of Women Voters of Tallahassee Board of Directors and chaired the Lobby Corps and membership committees. Lobby Corps monitors the state legislature and frequently testifies for the League. And Trish is one of those frequent commenters, the most frequent commenter. Trish comes from a 30-year career in various corporate management and executive leadership positions. Our second speaker, Frank Alcock, is the Director of Academic Initiatives and Special Projects and Professor of Political Science and Environmental Studies at New College of Florida. He holds a PhD in political science from Duke University and a MA in international affairs from George Washington University and a BA in economics from Binghamton University. He has been at New College since 2003 and is a frequent speaker for the League. Among many other organizations, he's a frequent speaker for. So Trish, it's all yours.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I just want to thank you, Alice, for the opportunity to speak to your members and to my members too, who are on here, as well as, just the general supporters that may be on here about the 2023 legislative session. And it's a delight to share the stage with Dr. Frank Alcock, who I've heard a lot about. And I want to thank you to everybody who's tuning in, sharing your lunch with us. So, Ginger, if you'd go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint. And I'll let you know when to advance. So we're going to be talking about League advocacy and lobbying today. And one of the questions that I get often is, what's the difference between advocacy and lobbying? So next slide, let's kind of talk about that. So the League has, as you all know, a very broad policy agenda. And as members, we are always educating and advocating. We do this year round. We do it by showing public support for our agenda, by recommending our programs and our positions. That's what we call advocating. Lobbying is a very specific form of advocacy. It involves influencing and persuading, just like we do year-round with our advocacy, but it is influencing and persuading public officials. We want them to support our agenda, particularly our state representatives and senators. And as unpaid volunteers, we don't have to register as lobbyists. So, that's a great thing. So while we advocate for our very broad policy agenda, it's really not feasible to lobby on the full agenda. So what we do is we annually identify legislative priorities. But how? And what does lobbying look like? So let's go to the next slide. Now, figuring out what's going to fall into that tiny little intersection, if you're looking at a Venn diagram between our issues on one side and what the legislature is liable to take up on the other side, that is a very difficult task. And it's our responsibility that falls upon our League of Women Voters of Florida board on an annual basis. But they don't do it alone. They do it with a lot of different inputs. So one of the most important things to do is to look at the prior year session, look at those results and kind of get a feeling for what might be likely to roll forward. What is there an appetite to take up something that maybe didn't pass one year, but maybe, the winds have changed a little bit. So you might want to present it again on the following year. The board also seeks inputs from the grassroots, and that's probably what I consider to be one of the most important inputs. So our membership statewide is asked to consider the 12 spotlight issues. And you can see the spotlight issues there at the very top right of the screen. So consider those issues and decide which are having or will have the greatest impact in your particular community. The board also seeks input from our statewide action issue chairs. And many of these folks are experts in their specific fields of study. In fact, it's why many were selected to be the committee chair to begin with. And those statewide committees are often part of broader statewide coalitions and networks. So there's an incredible amount of institutional knowledge that can be gained from reaching out and trying to do an assessment of what these folks know and to get their input on what should be our priorities. And of course, the board also seeks input from our professional lobbying firm. If you don't know, it's Capital Alliance Group. They've been the State League's lobbying firm for, I think, 4 years now. Dr. Jeff Sharkey is the founder and CEO and just absolutely a wonderful person to deal with. Jeff and his team have nurtured relationships with the top policy makers, and their knowledge and insight into the political process has, for me in particular, has been absolutely invaluable. And I know the rest of the team feels exactly the same way. So you take all those inputs and then, think of yourself as being a member of the board. So you take it, you analyze it, swish it around a little bit, do a little bit of crystal balling. And what you end up with is a very small concise list of legislative priorities. And it's so important to keep it a small list and to keep it focused, because we don't want to dilute our message. You know, particularly for people like our legislators who don't really know the league that well. They only know what they think they know about the league. It's important for us to not confuse them too much, and stick to election reform always as our number one, and then just a few others after that, that are important to the league. So, the little stars on there, I made an attempt to kind of identify what the 4 top ones were for this year, and probably most of you know it, but we'll talk about those in a little more depth in a minute. So what happens if our predictions are off? And of course they can be. You know, we try to get a pretty good idea of what the legislature is likely to take up, but we're not always right. So if our predictions are off, or there's an unexpected bill that pops up, one that is very important to us, we pivot. I mean, it's as simple as that, because what we want to do is always be looking at those things that are most important to the league. As an example of what pops up often that we weren't expecting, has to do with bills that are preemption bills. They're designed to show, you know, those naughty progressive local governments who's really the top dog. And Jeff Sharkey, our lobbyist, all of our statewide action chairs in the state office constantly monitor bills that are filed. And if we're off, like I said, we just pivot. We reallocate our resources and our energies. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's that Venn diagram I was talking about, and the legislative priorities sit right there in that teeny tiny little space in the middle, with spotlight issues on the left and legislative action on the right. So we have Friday strategy sessions. They're held on Zoom. They begin during the interim session and continue through sine die at the end of the general session. Our Friday sessions determine what our lobbying is going to look like for the following week. Now, there are key players. You see them all here on the screen. I tried to capture pictures of everybody in action. Jeff Sharkey, as I said, he's the founder and CEO of Capital Alliance Group. There's me with my bullhorn. I just love to shout like that. Blake Summerlin and Leah Nash play a critical role throughout the process. You see Cecile Schoon, and then I included Jennifer Adams. Jennifer Adams played a really important role this year. She was the advocate chair for some of our action team leaders. I hope that role is going to continue, although I know Jennifer is not remaining on the board. But again, it was an important role that she played. So Blake manages, we use lobby tools. Blake manages the bills in there. And on Thursday, you see a sample of what our agenda calendar will look like for the following week. And it's the responsibility of this group to look at what is coming up and to decide what are we going to do. The meetings are very efficient, 30 minutes tops. When I was an executive, we used to refer to these as stand-up meetings. In fact, we would make people stand up so that the meetings wouldn't run too long. Only the bills that are up on the calendar for the following week are discussed, and they are only discussed by the key members, and particular the action team leaders. Only the chairs speak for their committees, or if the chair is not available, they have a designee. Let's see. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So if the action involves testimony, only leaguers testify. And that's very important because it's important. And we always say I'm a volunteer for the league when we're up there and we're about to testify, because it's important that they understand that we are the league that is speaking. We are not a lobbying group. So only leaguers testify. And Tallahassee Lobby Corps does the majority of the heavy lifting, although Cecile Schoon and some of the other action chairs will also travel to Tallahassee and testify when we really need the big guns to be there. If the action is only for us to go on record, testimony is important, but sometimes all we want to do is to go into that committee and state our position and have it be on the record. Capital Alliance Group usually does that for us, so that we might be off doing something else, and that's just a service that they provide for us. Jeff Sharkey always lobbies behind the scenes for us and offers insights that really enrich the testimony that we provide, make it a little bit more nuanced than based on what he's heard outside of the committee meetings and behind the scenes. Okay, next slide. So there are other actions that we as a group may decide that need to be taken. And this includes marching in solidarity. Maybe we've heard about a march that's about to happen, and it would be important for the league to be there. Or maybe we have pressed the march to begin with, and we're inviting others to come along with us. We hold press conferences, rallies. I mean, there's just so many different things. Meeting with legislators is sometimes critical. Jeff does a lot of behind the scenes, but we've got to be in front of the scenes too, getting our voice out there. And then it's important that all of you do your part as well. Action alerts, please respond to those action alerts, because when you respond and you press your legislators, it's important that they hear from their constituents, and they are more likely to follow their constituents than what they are anyone else. You're the one actually who elected them, so they pay attention to what you do. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this year, there were less than 1,900 bills filed, which I thought was pretty amazing. There's usually about 3,000 or 4,000, but I guess super majorities mean they don't have to work on too many bills. Of that, about 1,900, only 400 actually made it out of committee. If it doesn't make it out of committee, it dies. So it never goes before either the House or the Senate session. There were a few good bills that are going to help communities. For example, I was very pleasantly surprised with the amount of money that was budgeted for affordable housing. But overall, I have to say it was a pretty disappointing year for us as a progressive, with our progressive agenda. This top pick, I wanted to include that in there. We happened to be at the U.S. convention the day that the Dobbs decision came out as the Supreme Court, and we all marched to the Denver Capitol. So I thought I'd just include that picture in there. Next slide. So, talking about some of the results, and I'm going to start with election reform. There were two bills that were really troubling, having to do with school boards. The first one was this whole concept of partisan school boards. It passed, but what that means is it goes before the voters in 2024 as a ballot initiative. So what I would say to all of us is we have a lot of educating to do between now and then to make sure that the voters understand what having a partisan school board actually means. And then also the 8-year term limits that the governor signed. They're concerning because it looks like a potential takeover of more progressive or moderate thinking school boards. Maybe that won't be the case, but that's how it appears. And then, of course, the horrible elections bill. I mean, last year I was thinking, gosh, what else could they possibly do? Well, of course, they turned around and came out with something this year that is going to have a huge impact on third-party voter organizations like the League. It's going to impact students, student campus voting, because it's created more restrictions for them to have to deal with. And at the last minute, as everyone suspected, there was added the opportunity for the governor to run for president without having to resign. The one thing about the election bill, and by the way, we're going to receive a lot more information about this from the state leagues. So, I don't want to steal any of their thunder about what it is that they're doing. But within that bill is a requirement to give a receipt to anyone that you have taken their registration form. One idea is to don't touch the forms. Have tablets, laptops, and phones. We're a third-party organization when we touch the receipt. So if we don't, or when we touch the registration form. So don't touch it. Let the participant do it. You can be right there with them, helping them work through, but let them do it electronically. Another thing. Oh, permitless carry. You might think that having to do with guns on an election reform list is unusual, but the League actually looks at gun safety as an election issue, because the ability to be able to vote without fear is very important to the League. So gun safety is an election issue. And then there were two things that never made it out of committee that I wanted to mention. One was the constitutional amendments. The particular representative has brought this up every year for the past 7 years, and for the past 7 years it's died. And it's to increase constitutional amendments from 60 to 66% of the amount of the prior election voters that have to pass. Also, national popular vote died again. I don't see us ever getting that in the state of Florida. There's just no appetite for it. Okay, next slide. Okay, reproductive health and justice. We were kind of surprised that the 6-week ban actually reared its head when President Kathleen Passidomo said she had no appetite for it, but apparently the governor did. So it reared its head, it passed, but both the 15-week ban and the 6-week ban are going to have to wait until the court rules on the constitutionality of it. The one thing about the 6-week ban, which President Passidomo got in there, was adding provisions for rape and incest. The only problem is the proof requirement for that is so difficult and challenging that it may be something that people just don't even bother to do. Protection of medical conscience. I shared this with my third year nursing student granddaughter, who was absolutely appalled that something like this would actually have made it through the legislature, let alone even be considered. It's licensed to discriminate, and it can be abused by providers or insurers. They can deny care on a vague basis of religion, moral, or ethical beliefs. And then no sex reassignments, which I think is interesting. Why not let the parents decide? You know, we do have that as something that's very important to Florida, but apparently usurping parental rights when it suits is just not going to be a problem for our supermajority. Okay, next slide. Vouchers. So the league has been fighting the voucher expansion since vouchers were introduced by Governor Bush all those many years ago. And it's not because we object to vouchers per se. What we object to is the way that they're funded and the drain on our public school system, as well as the lack of accountability for parents in some of the school settings. And then higher education, which is really higher education takeover. And I'm sure that our next speaker can speak to that with firsthand knowledge. We just oppose muzzling ideas that are, oops, sorry, let me turn that phone off. We oppose muzzling ideas that that one group doesn't like, and you know, getting rid of DEI in the classroom and oh my, you know, having curricula under the control of political appointees. I think the biggest concern is just what is it going to do to our wonderful education system. One bill, House Bill 19, which was introduced by Allison Tant, one of our local representatives, is something that the league supported. It's great for certain students. It contains legal rights and responsibilities that transfer to them at the age of 18. This is a bill that's great for students who are disabled or mentally challenged in any way. And it also gives their parents an opportunity to stay involved in their education beyond the age of 18. And then, of course, we now have don't say gay provisions through the 8th grade, which is so unfortunate. Okay, next slide. Natural resources. The shared use trail, the league supported this in concept, but we took issue with the impact that it could have on wildlife, which I hated that happened, because we could have really scored some brownie points with President Kathleen Passidomo otherwise. But you know, sometimes you just have to take a stand, and we felt that having a little better influence over how wildlife would be treated was important. Unfortunately, the bill sponsor wasn't interested in our ideas to make it better. Environmental protection reduces barriers to land purchasing and pollution and improves water quality. So we definitely supported that one. The last one, local government comprehensive plans. We oppose this because it is bad for communities. It's great for developers, but it allows a prevailing party to recover attorney fees in challenges to comp plan amendments. So what that means is that legally flawed development decisions are likely to proceed without being challenged because the challengers don't want to risk losing and then having to pay the others court costs. So it was a difficult session. It was really difficult to remain steady and upbeat with the supermajority pushing through the governor's agenda. And I don't know if you paid attention to the news yesterday, you may have, but in the wake of denying history and the whole anti-woke agenda, the NAACP issued a travel advisory yesterday for Florida, saying that the state is inhospitable to minorities. And then, of course, there's the whole Disney debacle with $1 billion investment, going down the tubes. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the governor's agenda is going to play out on the national stage. One of the things that I found most disappointing was I know that there were some legislators, and I know this because I've spoken to them, who were not necessarily in support of everything that was coming down the pike as part of the supermajority, but they voted for it anyway. So to them, it was, more about self-interest rather than the interests of their constituents, which I just really hate that happened. But I have to say that I was extremely proud of our new Republican senator who voted against the 6-week abortion ban. So I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite quotes here: in the midst of chaos, there is always opportunity. When chaos gets too much, we tend to look to those who can offer some stability. So with that in mind, I think there's a lot of opportunity for a trusted organization like the League. And winds are going to change, my friends. They are going to change. So with that, Alice, back to you and to Dr. Alcock for his insights.
Thank you, Trish. And we will move on to Dr. Alcock.
Okay, thank you, Alice, and thank you, Trish, for that very helpful overview. Let me start again to try to put in context why this year was unusual with respect to a lot of the dynamics that you might typically see in a legislative session. And then I'll just hit on some of the notable pieces of legislation that have caught my eye, some of which Trish already talked about. In a number of states, you have mixed control over the legislature or the governor's mansion, which automatically necessitates some horse trading, negotiations, jockeying, sort of moderating down when one of the two legislative chambers is controlled again by a minority party, and or if you have both chambers controlled by one party, sometimes you get a governor that's of another party. Florida hasn't been one of those places in quite some time, but even in states that you have full control, partisan control over both chambers as well as the governor's mansion, there's still a lot of negotiations that can happen, in part because there's a spectrum of preferences within parties. And while in houses, you tend to see usually a bit more partisanship, within Senate chambers, there are longer terms there, and they usually have larger areas that they're responsible for. So the folks that typically rise up the food chain are pretty good deal makers, and that tends to be a little bit of a moderating force. It's not a law, of dynamics in any sense, but you'll find more moderate Senate presidents generally than House speakers. And then depending upon the state that we're talking about, some governors will often have aspirations, perhaps running for the presidency, and sometimes want to demonstrate their ability to govern broader ranges. And so they can act sometimes as a moderating force. This year in Florida, forget about all of that. What we had, I mean, the context was a governor that it was coming off of a 20-point electoral victory in a state that for a number of decades has been viewed as a swing state or a toss-up state, even though Republicans have won the vast majority of statewide electoral races. They've been close for quite some time. Not this time. So a very substantial and striking victory for a governor that has political aspirations. And so coming into this legislative session, you had a projection of dominance, and that reverberated, I think, through the entire legislature. Even those that might have some moderate inclinations were largely frightened, I think, of crossing a very, very powerful governor, and a governor that, from my standpoint, strategy was fairly clear with respect to not wanting to be outflanked on the right by anybody in a Republican primary, and with respect to taking on, former President Trump, wanted to be able to say, putting points on the board, getting things done, and he wanted to get things done that nobody would get something done more right wing. With respect to the issues, what you saw and what you continue to see from the governor is, headlong, charge in a culture war. More so than often, you'll see a lot of governors or agendas positioning with respect to economic issues, deregulation, pro-business. Not the case really with this governor in this session, and choosing to take on Disney in the way that he has. I mean, that is leaning very heavily into the culture war. Also, the immigration legislation, I'll just mention it in a bit, but E-Verify, not very popular with business. And so, with respect to business mixed messaging, it was subordinated to how he, is able to portray himself as in the vanguard of the culture war for the country. And even on, foreign issues, you've seen him even waffle a little bit on the Ukraine situation. Which again, for him, the base on the right and the culture war, it was preeminent. And the results of this session are, I'm still trying to get my head around them. We've not really seen anything quite this robust, and I think the word extreme probably is appropriate. So I'll walk through some of the things that most comfortable speaking about. The education, I think it's striking. That has been, I think, since Youngkin's victory in Virginia a few years back, Republicans have wanted to make this an extremely salient, if not one of the most salient issues. Issues of education, trying to portray education as a hostage of the woke liberal bureaucracy, and they were going to come at it very strongly. The bill that has the most in it that passed and was signed recently on my campus here last week, Senate Bill 266, which largely bans any funding and dismantles anything that says or looks like diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think one of the more problematic elements is a ban on teaching certain types of ideas. And that did go through some changes last minute, and it ended up in a fairly vague place with respect to systemic oppression being banned, or distortion of history. And these are things that one might ask, well, how are you going to interpret what's accurate and what's not? There's a great deal of discretion there. So there's some broader, they were attempting to specify some of the majors that they didn't want to see taught. That actually has been softened a little bit, but there's this broad language and types of curricula that are not liked, I suppose, by the legislation. The other, I think, most salient part of Bill 266 is a consolidation of power within college presidency positions with respect to hiring, promotion decisions, tenure, firing. The language now really runs afoul of a lot of collective bargaining agreements that are around the state. They may hold for another year or two, but what the bill does is it really, I think, poses a challenge, and it would dramatically gut notions of shared governance. And again, whether they're reflected in collective bargaining agreements, accreditation standards, Board of Governor regulations, I think the momentum is to come and comply now with this legislation, which really gives college presidents a great deal of power to hire whom they want, fire whom they want, or for the reasons that they want, without any input or checks from student government or faculty government. So dramatic in that sense. Some other lesser known bills, a couple that were signed on our campus. One, Senate Bill 931, creating an Office of Public Policy Events and requiring 4 events per year that have or represent a diversity of widely held views. Again, one of these things that are, it's fairly vague in terms of how it would interpret, but the idea is that all SUS institutions now are going to be doing public policy oriented events that I would imagine reflect the viewpoints that the legislature would like to see reflected. I don't think you can comply with this without having a full range of opinions, but you know, the boundaries of what would be a widely held view and an extreme view or an offensive view really subject to discretion and diversity. You had mentioned, actually you didn't mention, I think, another bill that I think is important, Senate Bill 256, which was passed. And what that's going to do, it's going to require a threshold for unions to remain certified to move from 50 to 60% of those that are represented being dues paying members. What'll typically happen at a number of colleges is that you cannot force anybody to be to pay dues and joining a union. And when a union negotiates with the administration, they represent the entire bargaining unit or anybody that's eligible to join the union, but not all of them might pay for being official union members. This the current threshold is 50%. This will bump it to 60%. It might sound like minutia, but my understanding there are a lot of places out there that are between the 50 and 60% threshold. What this would do is would allow it a university's administration to decertify and essentially dissolve the union, and that could have very, very strong implications. So not a lot of attention on that one, but I do think it's important. I don't want to burn the whole time on education bills. You mentioned a couple, not at the higher ed level, but I do think that are relevant from an election standpoint, but the school boards. And so putting in term limits, which is going to go before the voters. They'll have to vote on, no, I'm sorry, the term limits are there, but putting in the partisanship of rather than being nonpartisan races being partisan. It would take a little while to explain, but this is likely going to get you some more conservative school boards and dislodge some longer standing school board members that are probably typically viewed as fairly moderate, and the communities like them and they stay on a while. This will sort of force them out and kind of allow for, in many cases, more partisan folks to come on. Another area in the culture war that I think you mentioned, the abortion bill, which is going to be challenged, but there is just a wide slate of anti-LGBTQ bills that are now being passed into law. Senate Bill 1438 prohibits children from attending things that are being defined as drag shows. But again, that has a lot of latitude in how it might be enforced. 1580 will allow for medical professionals to not give care if it conflicts with their religious views. 254, I think you mentioned, will ban any sort of gender affirming medical care for anybody that's a minor. And then for those that are not minor, there are some restrictions in there with respect to using state funding. And so very, very significant restrictions on medical access or access to gender affirming care. 1521 prohibits anybody from using a bathroom other than that that conforms with the gender that they were assigned at birth. 1069 on the House side prohibits any form of sexual education now or gender identity type of education until you get to high school, and you have to use assigned gender pronouns now. So any pronoun type of interactions with students that are in the LGBTQ or that use alternative or neo pronouns, that's banned as well. So a lot there. It is quite a docket of anti-LGBTQ bills. The immigration bill, which is going to provide stronger penalties if you don't use E-Verify for businesses that are 25 employees or more. Harsh penalties for any trafficking. It bans undocumented folks from becoming lawyers or being recognized or getting the bar. Driver's license restrictions too. Out-of-state licenses that were given to undocumented immigrants are not valid in the state of Florida. One of the stronger elements, though, did not make it through, and that was Governor DeSantis wanted to ban Florida state tuition for any undocumented immigrants, and that was ultimately kept out of the final bill. That's, I think, the package of sort of the main features of the big culture war push, in addition to the ones that Trish had mentioned. Other things that I just think are worthy, a couple out there. You had mentioned in terms of the Trish governance with respect to legal fees if a comp amendment is challenged unsuccessfully. I think a different bill, I think we're talking about the same bill, but 170 opens the door for lawsuits for any municipal ordinances that are viewed to be unreasonable. So, okay, if now I guess that a municipal government would like to do something that somebody out there can claim reasonably as defined by a court that the change or the ordinance was unreasonable, now you can get sued for that as a municipality. House Bill 3 will open up the possibility of lawsuits if there are any restriction of finance for ESG, environment and social government purposes. My read of that is not that like there can't be funds, that would just be catastrophic. But if financial institutions restrict loan or access to financing on the basis of you're on the right, you're in the fossil fuel industry, or you're an extreme right group that's looking for a loan or something in terms of guns, then you can get sued for that. The last one is interestingly under the auspices of security concerns with a number of, I would say, to the list. There is now a new law that will restrict any contracts or commercial activity that involves personal information. And then there's also apparently restrictions from ownership of real estate within a certain type of distance from a list of sensitive facilities. There was a push at the end on the part of a number of Florida-based Chinese groups that this is going to be an open ticket for a lot of discrimination that ultimately fell on some deaf ears. So that one got through as well. I mean, I'll limit to those. Those are the highlights, and I'll just let me close by a couple of bigger things to keep an eye on. I would imagine, or I'm not a fan of much of this legislature. I think there's more vulnerability here on these pieces of legislation to legal challenge than anything else that I've seen. A number of components of the bills that were passed into law, again, run afoul of other contract law. They also, I think, run afoul sometimes of constitutional rights issues. So expect to see a lot of legal challenges, potential injunctions. The court system is sort of gravitating towards the right as well. So I just don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty there in terms of the outcomes of what I expect to be a lot of legal challenges. There's also whether or not something is ultimately rejected by the courts. There's just a tremendous amount of interpretive uncertainty. A lot of these bills, you look at what is either banned or what entities must do, and there are lots of questions. Can you do this? Do you have to do that? And it's unclear on the part of the legislation itself. And one of the things we know as political scientists is the less the clarity in the rules, typically the more abuse of power that you're likely to see. And so while there can be arguments that the intent is not to ban this or that, the actual vagueness of a lot of what has just been passed really opens the door to abuses of power in terms of their implementation. Impacts that we might look at just for on the relative short term, I would keep my eyes out for brain drain and business. I really, and I can be proven wrong, I think you're starting to see, and it will become clear over the next year, that this state is going to lose a significant portion of its better faculty, the grants associated with that. You might even see it on the impact of with students. Might not be clear until the fall or next winter, but keep an eye out for explicit indicators or metrics of a brain drain that's happening in the state. There is less certainty around business impact. You're going to see, I think, after the NAACP, maybe some boycotts with respect to tourism in terms of short-term visits to Florida. I'm not so sure. So I do think while there'll be certain events that might get canceled and certain types of individuals on matters of principles that no longer want to come to Florida, there are others that might want to, they like it or they don't care. They're coming for a vacation. So the jury's out. I'm not sure what to expect on tourism dollars, but I do think on bigger investment dollars, similar to what you see or just have seen in Disney, I do think there's going to be a pause with respect to major investments, and especially if they involve relocation of employees, because what is happening in Florida, I think, is going to really tick the heck out of, maybe half the population around the country. And if you're going to move your business or relocate your business, you don't want a third to a half of your employees not to want to come with you to the state. And so that's another thing to, again, keep an eye out in terms of the impact of a package or a suite of legislation that I do think really, really pushes the extreme envelope on what we've seen on cultural war issues in particular.
Okay,
Stop there.
Frank, yeah, we, let's, if you don't mind, if we could run to maybe 5 after with questions so we can get the questions in. So Ginger, what questions do you have?
Okay, the first question came in during Trish's presentation, and I'm going to read it, Trish. How can we have a bigger impact during the legislative session? Do we not get enough participation from action alerts? I read about student dreamers who met with legislators and made a significant impact on the issue of in-state tuition. How can we do something similar?
I think the biggest problem that we have as a league is that we look at the legislative session as the be all end all, and it's not. If we're doing things during the session, and that's the only time we've done it, we've lost. And oftentimes we have. It's that pre-session, it's that year-round advocacy and lobbying that's so important. And I was very pleased for what the students were able to accomplish. They were able to mobilize, and they were a good-sized group, and they made a huge impact. We also have a problem of being an older organization, and it's not as easy to pull us all together and have that same kind of impact, despite the fact that we're trying hard to reach out and pull in other communities. But the biggest thing for me is we need to stop thinking about it just being the legislative session when we take action.
Thank you. And for either one of you, one of our participants was looking for some clarification around the use of pronouns in schools. And if the question or the statement was, I didn't think that pronouns were banned. I thought the bill language stated that teachers wouldn't be punished if they didn't use what the student requested. Could one of you expand on or clarify what the language is for educators about pronouns?
Frank, you want to take that one?
Let me take a crack at it. I don't have it in front of me. I think it's a good point. I think the questioner is correct that there can be no punishment, there can be no policy that forces anybody to use pronouns. I do think that has been interpreted in some places as not to have a gender affirming policy in place, but the language itself, I can go back and look it up, or the questioner can look it up, but I don't think it bans pronouns. It actually it bans any penalties or punishment of anybody that refuses to use them.
Okay, thank you. And the final question we have in chat is for Frank. Frank, you mentioned that vagueness leads to challenges, I think, but the question was vagueness leads to fear to act. So you were talking about vagueness in the language of the bills that are signed.
Yes. So I think in a vacuum without explicit rules that tell you what behavior is allowable or not, powerful actors will push the envelope in terms of how they can interpret it until something checks them, until they go over the line. So you do get that abusive power. And then I think what the question was directed at, knowing that or not knowing where the line can be crossed, you get a chilling effect in terms of people will self-censor and or self-police their own behavior, even if that wasn't restricted in the legislation, because they don't know where the line is and they're afraid, even if they don't think they crossed it, a powerful actor will come and try to target them with a lawsuit or fire them or something like that.
Okay. Thank you, Trish and Frank. We covered a lot of territory today, and I'm sure that if anybody is interested, Ginger, you have something?
I just had one kind of late breaking question or I think it needs a little clarification if you think we have time, if not.
Go ahead.
So Deb says national popular vote is about to become law in Minnesota. Florida doesn't need to pass it for it to become law. And I guess I agree.
Not a question.
Yeah, Florida doesn't need to pass it for Florida, but you know, what Minnesota does doesn't necessarily affect what Florida does or doesn't do.
Yeah.
Right. It's a good thing that Florida doesn't have to pass it, because I don't see that ever happening.
Yeah.
Anytime soon.
270 electoral votes, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, that's another presentation.
Yeah, that's another presentation. Okay, I thank you both. That you covered a lot of territory. If somebody wants Trish's presentation, it's got all those bill numbers in it. Just email info@lwvmanatee.org and I will get that out to you. Also, check our calendar of events on our website, lwvmanatee.org. Tomorrow we have a 4 o'clock Motorworks to distribute petitions and materials for the 2 constitutional amendments we're supporting. The get abortion on the ballot and also the clean and healthy water one. And we're going to have our picture taken with signs supporting reproductive rights and, you know, generally have a good time. We will continue in the summer having our every other week Wednesday morning coffees. Will alternate between the Panera and Lakewood Ranch and the Panera on Manatee Avenue. So the next one will be June, the next, also in June 22nd, we have our Taste of the League, where we take by every other month, pretty much, we take one element of the league, and this next one is going to be the convention. So you'll hear there's 5 of us going. You'll hear about a lot of stuff that goes on with the convention. And so that's on the convention itself is on June 2nd and 3rd, where we'll set those priorities that Trish was talking about. So check our website. And if you have not already done so, we invite you to join the league.